All right, everybody. Welcome to the Theology in Motion podcast. I am Erik, the host, as usual, because I have no one else to work for me. And today we're having a really great conversation. I've titled it Revival or Renewal. Seen a couple blogs lately and other podcasts that talk about the idea of revival in the church. The idea that we need God to come in this North American type of revival where God comes in and gives everybody fresh insight, vision, and motivation, and everything but revived sense of mission from the Bible. And so today we want to talk about the idea of revival in that sense versus renewal, a renewal of our commitment to biblical patterns and biblical principles of establishing and growing the church. And so for that, probably one of the most qualified people I know to have a conversation on that will be thought-provoking and deeply biblical is my friend, Pastor Mike Neigh. He's from Durkeetown Baptist Church. We'll introduce him a little bit. Most important thing you need to know about him is he rides a motorcycle. And so how many pastors do you know that ride a motorcycle? Well, wait, let me ask. Do you ride your motorcycle often now?
Oh, yeah, I still ride it much as I can.
Okay. See, I've only known one pastor in my life who rides a motorcycle. So you're one of the only ones, you know? Is it a Harley?
No, I'm sorry, it's not.
Okay.
Not a Harley.
What kind is it? I don't know motorcycles very well.
It's a Honda Rebel.
Okay.
The biggest 250 Honda Rebel they make.
Okay. See, I don't know the numbers. I thought the higher the number, the bigger the engine and all.
Yes,
so.
You're right. So 250 is pretty small, actually.
Okay. So you got a dirt bike, basically.
Well, you know, kind of that, yeah. Okay. But I tell you what, I get 70 miles to the gallon. You're not finding that on a hog anywhere.
Well, there you go. Yeah, exactly. So, and it's better than my car.
There you go. And as much as I ride, got to understand, I ride for business, not just for pleasure. I do both, but I ride for my work. It's as much as I can ride it for my work, I do. So,
okay, and let's dive into that a little bit. And so, I think I've met you 4 years ago, 2018.
Okay.
Through Pastor Ken, so he's a pastor there at Durkeetown also. We've gotten to talk a lot through then and through Antioch, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so, if I understand right, you're pastoring at Durkeetown. You are the director for CentrePoint Ministries. Is that right?
Actually, I'm the developer for CentrePoint. Nick Miller's the director. Yep.
Okay. And then you have been married. You have more kids than I know about, but you've been married since '93. Was that almost 30 years?
Yeah, 20. What is that? 29 this year we celebrated.
Fantastic. Okay. Yeah. You've been married. And you're a second generation missionary kid.
My parents were missionaries, so I'm a first generation missionary kid, right?
Okay.
My parents were missionaries, and I'm a first generation third culture kid. So I grew up in a different culture than the one I was born into. Right,
because you were in Vienna?
Yep. Grew up in Vienna 11 years, Vienna, Austria.
Wow. So the first 11 years of your life were in Vienna?
Almost. We went over when I was 2.5. We came back when I was 13. So my formative years, yes, were in Vienna. And in the school system there, so I went to school in the Austrian school system. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you have to, I imagine you come to North America, you almost have to re-assimilate, although your parents are North American, but it's a whole new culture, I would guess, for you as a teen.
There were a lot of things different. So one thing about us growing up as missionaries, my parents were not actually missionaries to the Austrian people. They were missionaries in Eastern Europe, which at the time was behind the Iron Curtain.
Right.
So we didn't adopt the Austrian culture in our home at the same level that maybe a missionary would who was ministering to the Austrian people. We had a pretty much American home. So I had a lot of basic American stuff, in my mind, but I did have a learning curve when I got home. It was a bit different, and the kids I was with had a learning curve too, because the first question most of them would ask when I told them I'd grown up in Austria is if I had ever seen a kangaroo, and I would say yes, in the zoo. like you,
Right.
because I'm not in Australia. But that took a while for people to figure out. They have no idea where Austria is. Austria, what's that? It just was one of the largest empires, in the Middle Ages. But that's a whole other story. So.
And at this time, you guys are, I think, living in the Midwest when you come to the States?
Yeah, so my dad mom and dad were missionaries with Child Evangelism Fellowship, and their headquarters is in Warrenton, Missouri, about an hour west of St. Louis. So that was my high school years were there.
Okay. Yeah. And so how do we get you from there to upstate New York now? Is there some missions trips? Is there,
At that time, I didn't know there was an upstate New York. That was pretty funny. I knew New York City. I had come through New York City airports a couple times, but I didn't know there was an upstate New York. And it was kind of weird. In Austria, they didn't really teach a whole lot of American history or geography, strange as that may seem. Mm-hmm. So, we're the only ones that think we're the center of the universe. So, so what happened was with Child Evangelism Fellowship, they had a program at the time called Overseas Summer Missions, and they would bring high school graduates, college-age students out to the headquarters for 2 weeks, train them to teach boys and girls the gospel of the Bible, and then send them to primarily the English-speaking countries around the world for 6 weeks. Okay. And so in 1990, on my second time going, I was going to Australia. I met this girl, Allison, from upstate New York, who was going actually to the military bases over in Germany. And so we met there. We only got about a week together because she had the training is in early June because most of the rest of the country gets out of school at the end of May, unlike New York. Mm-hmm. So she had to come back for graduation and stuff. But we met and we kept in contact. We both went through the program for 91 and 92. And then in 92 in the fall, actually in the summer, we decided, you know what, we're going to make this thing into something permanent. So got engaged in October 92 and married in June of 93.
Wow.
So I moved up to upstate New York to marry Allison because she was going to school at Cornell University at the time. And so it made more sense for me to move up here. The job I was working was just a printing job. It wasn't a career type of thing. And then we shuttled back and forth between here and Missouri because I got a job out at the headquarters again. And then we came out here to work with CEF as a local director. And that's how I ended up in the Glens Falls area where I am now. Went back out to Missouri and then got a call from Durkeetown asking if we would come out and if I would help Ken co-pastor the congregation. At that time, it was about 185 people and growing. So we came back out in 2003. And I've been here since. Yeah.
No, give a word for us. I know that even still, when we say upstate New York, people don't have a picture, right? The first time I met Ken and I heard about upstate New York, I still think about New York City, but maybe suburbs or something. But how would you consider? Yeah, because you guys have a village near you. They say, we're going to have you at the village of St. James. What's that like?
I live in one of the most prominent dairy counties of New York State. So, I live out in the country. I'm rural. And so I was mentioning Glens Falls, which is kind of our big city, if you will. And I think the population is only like 25,000. So it's not suburbs. It's very much country out here. You do have Lake George a little north of us, which people sometimes are familiar with because a lot of the New York City wealthy people in like the 1800s built cabins and stuff up here, and they would come up and vacation up at Lake George. So it's a big vacation area north of me. Washington County, not so much, and then we border right along Vermont. So that sometimes helps people realize, you're like, Vermont, Vermont's all rural pretty much. So, we're kind of like that.
And so you've been pastoring at Durkeetown since 2003. And the one thing I do wonder now that I'm hearing all of the story is how you end up pastoring and not necessarily going back out into the mission field. Is that because of family? Is that because your heart was more so for Durkeetown?
Yeah, so I had been developing a shift in my thinking about ministry that was moving away from parachurch ministries that were disconnected from the church.
Hmm.
And so being in the local church doing ministry was becoming much more important for me. And so pastoring was sort of the pathway at that time into that. And I had gotten to know Ken when I was a local director up here. We used to spend once a month, we'd go up to a pastor's fellowship together. It's about an hour drive up and back. And then we'd meet once a week for prayer. We worked through Reformed theology together with R.C. Sproul's, some of his videos. So we really became close friends. And when it was decided that they needed help, they wanted me to come out and do that. And it was good timing, really, because I was in a position where I was beginning to realize I need to get into local church ministry that needs to be central, not mission organizations.
Yeah, two things come to my mind as I listen to that. You mentioned about parachurch ministries, but even also about the local church. And a lot of times we think things like missions and even church planting is a parachurch operation or a network operation and not something that starts with the local church. And when I think about it, is if when church is being done right, when church is church, you're raising up missionaries, you're raising up church planters. And I can imagine, you approaching 20 years of pastoring in the Northeast. There's been some shifts, right? I became a Christian in '97, and at one point it was like the moral majority kind of political upheaval, right, within evangelicalism, and the focus on the families and the James Dobsons, and then over time, as I'm growing in my faith, I see there's it's kind of like the Adrian Rogers, right, versus the James Whites or the R.C. Sproul's,
Yeah.
And it was just that kind of almost infighting within the church in a sense, and then what you saw over the 2010s is kind of a racial, ethnic, not so much doctrinal splits, but just so many changes. But one thing I've seen, and I'm going to ask you to comment, is that there's always been this idea of how do we grow the church, and there's always been a voice or voices outside of the church saying, here's how you do it. And there's always and I don't want to be negative and say the gimmick, but there's gimmicks, there's strategies. I've heard, don't preach expository messages. You've got to get younger people if you want to reach young people. You've got to have good air conditioning, comfortable pews. You've got to see, you've got to do these things, these more attractional models. And I wonder what are the shifts you've seen in your ministry experience from 2003 till now? And how have you guys kind of navigated those pressures at Durkeetown?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues is that there's a divide that has kind of been brought in that doesn't need to be between the church and the parachurch. So I'm not necessarily opposed to parachurch, but most parachurches I know of really have very little connection to the local church, and certainly the way they operate doesn't tend to elevate the local church as God's instrument for expanding the kingdom. And so I think what Acts in particular, the book of Acts in particularly gives us is a way to do that, where the churches are very central. Local churches are very central to the expansion of the gospel by forming strong units that share the gospel in word and deed, as well as by raising up teams that go out and actually plant new churches by evangelizing areas that haven't been evangelized yet. So that's what we're working at. What I've seen up here is two things. One, a lot of church plants, this is how they function. Gather a significant number of people from your church, and when you get what they call a critical mass, you go and you start meeting in another place. And what I found with that, though, is very seldom does that actually turn into much growth, conversion growth. What it tends to attract are people from other churches in the area who don't like their church or whatever, and they want to check out the new one or something like that. But it's not a lot of conversion growth there. And then the other issue, in Acts 29, I've seen this a bit, and I want to be careful. I'm only going to say something that an Acts 29 guy said, and that is, Acts 29 did a really good job of planting churches to plant churches. What they didn't do as good a job of was establishing the planted church. And so they've been planting a lot of churches, but there was also a significant attrition rate if they didn't really pay attention to establishing. So the two have to go together. And here's where I think the parachurch often misses it. The parachurch does well at evangelizing and gathering people together, but they're not clear then on the establishing process. And so what they haven't developed often is a team like Paul did that could address both the planting and then turn that over to team members who are working on the establishing. And I think that's where one of the big misunderstandings is in relation to what the Bible is showing us about how to expand the church.
Right. It's almost like there was because I was one of those guys from, 2010, 2011, I heard of Acts 29. I started hearing podcasts. I heard Driscoll. I heard Chandler. I had heard about Erik Mason is in Philly planning a church, and it was blowing my mind because the context I was in, a church plant was basically a church split where an angry youth pastor would take some people with him and go start a church, and then it would fail after a while, and that was church planting. And here were people talking about a biblical model of not just church planting, but pursuing plurality of elders and, preaching doctrine and expository sermons, and then a network gathered together. And I think in some ways the movement, that end, people are critical now of Young, Restless, and Reformed, but so many of us got so much out of it in that, it seemed like they were building the plane as they were flying, but you're still seeing in motion, hey, here's how they're planting this church. Here's what's happening in Atlanta, in Texas, in the Northeast. And it was amazing. And it inspired a lot of us because we'd never seen it. What we never got to see, though, is what's on the other side of 10 years into church planting, and then that's something we're kind of seeing now. Right. But I still think there's been some good that's been done. But what many people, not all, have failed to do is they said, well, what's next? But they didn't go back to the Bible, right? It was like, okay, we've got the churches planted. We got to keep these things going. How do we keep the numbers coming in? Especially how do we keep the budget? That's a big pressure. Yeah. How do we keep the people coming in so we can plan? And I'm not, and this isn't an Acts 29 thing, but just overall in church planting culture, especially in urban environments, it was just how do we keep it going? And I think this is conjecture that a lot of times the idea is that what we see in the New Testament is very simple, probably too simple, right? Paul comes, he preaches, there's converts, there's community, there's leaders, there's accountability, there's structure. But that's it, and that's, I think, a little bit, hard for people to accept. You'd rather have somebody come and say, here's your 7-point strategy to grow your church. You have a launch. I knew a church that spent almost $7,000 just on launch day. And it's like, that's a lot of money, for balloons and other things like that. But I get it. Somebody tells you to do it. They have credibility, and you do it, and you skip over Paul's credibility. And what he did. Now, I assume, is that, when we think of CentrePoint, is that kind of how you got involved and kind of looking to be a force to help other churches establish?
So what happened was Durkeetown Baptist Church has been in existence, now, I don't know, probably 190 years. But around the 175-year mark, Pastor Ken started preaching through Acts during, I think it was actually a Wednesday Bible study. He started working through the book of Acts. And it struck him, we've never planted a church. We've given a lot of money to church planting. But we've never, Durkeetown's never planted a church. Why not? And so we began to investigate that. And out of that came this feeling like, you know what? Yeah, we should be planting a church. we're growing this huge church of 200 people in the middle of cornfields, and we need to really be thinking about other areas, And excuse me. So that began this idea of church planting, and that's how I first encountered Build. Actually, it was through a ministry up in Montreal, Canada, called SEMBEC, a seminary there for the Baptist churches, and they were using some of Build's material at the time. So that got me connected to Build, and as I began to look at that more, I began to see a way to plant churches that took serious what Acts and the Pauline epistles had to say about that. And so that's really what we began doing. And one of the things was, if you're going to plant a church, you're going to need leaders in that church. And so that began the movement then towards Antioch School to say, okay, we got to train these guys. And like you said, like you and I talked about before earlier, like rather than send them off somewhere and hope they come back, let's train them in the ministry for the ministry. And so that's kind of how CentrePoint really ended up being what I call a regional ministry team. So CentrePoint's parachurch. I'm not opposed to parachurch, but it's grounded in the local church. It is working to develop a network of churches, and then clusters within those networks to keep going. Yeah.
So you said a couple things I want to unpack.
Okay.
Primarily, one thing I loved was you said Pastor Kim was preaching through Acts, and in that he realizes we should be planting, right? It wasn't at a conference, even though there's nothing wrong with conferences. It wasn't from a podcast, and there's nothing wrong with podcasts. But it started with, we're going to preach the Word of God. We're going to go through this book. We're going to preach the whole counsel of God, right? And then out of that is an idea is born, right? And so I think there's something big there, because how a leader approaches, or how any Christian approaches the Bible, determines how we approach missions, outreach, how we live. Right? Many times we look for other things and we come back to the Bible, and what you're saying is it started with Scripture, right? It started with simply proclaiming and understanding Scripture, and then the Holy Spirit did the rest. And then from there, and I wanted to establish that because it's beautiful, right? That's probably the most simple but most profound thing, is that we need people who are biblically literate and committed to the Bible, committed to grasping and getting deeper into the Bible, mining its treasures. And from there, God will work. Sometimes I think many believers are looking for God to come out of nowhere, bypass the Bible, and speak to them in this big way and say, hey, here's what I want you to go do. And many times we haven't shaken the dust off our own text and and just seeing what is God going to say. And so that's first. You mentioned Build, so I want to get that for everybody. Build, as I understand it, BILD.org, I think it is. So I want to make sure they understand Build and what is Antioch, so we don't go by those too quick. And I want to get to those later, but I just, real briefly, if you'll just kind of help them understand Build and Antioch.
Okay, so Build came out of a local church. Jeff Reed was pastoring a church in Iowa. And as he was looking through the scriptures, as he was studying the scriptures, he came to an understanding again of Acts and Pauline as God's plan to expand and establish and equip. And so recognizing what he calls a Pauline team, or a regional ministry team, which is a group of leaders who are not disconnected from local churches, but they move out separately as an entity in order to be able to more quickly and more effectively do their work. And so this is what happened with Paul, right? This Antioch, Paul's at Antioch, and they're like, hey, Barnabas and Paul, you guys need to go out. And so they do. And what's interesting is by the time you get to the end of Acts, Antioch's nowhere in sight. And I don't mean that it didn't exist, but what I mean is Paul's not under the church at Antioch. He has developed this regional parachurch team. And so that's what Build essentially is. Build is the regional ministry team, if you will, the Pauline team that's born out of what's now called City Church of Ames, Des Moines, Iowa. It used to be called Oakwood Bible Church or Baptist Church, something like that. And then Antioch School, what happened there is Jeff Reed put together a training program to equip emerging leaders in the church and in his church, and began to start spreading that around overseas. And India was one of the big places where it was recognized, like, hey, we got a lot of churches beginning to form, but we don't have enough leaders. And we don't have the time to send them off to school or the money. We got to train them now while they're doing ministry. And so he developed a training program to train them in the church, by the church, for the church. And so that Antioch School then was a way to get a degree. It's got a degree program attached to it for people that really want a degree. So that's kind of the short build at Antioch School.
That is fantastic. And I think it's significant because you and I talked about this. We're in a moment right now in America where we are, I guess you could say post-pandemic. I don't know if we're post-COVID or not, but people are still remote. We are in a recession. There are economic troubles. There are troubles in many communities, whether rural, urban, suburban. And so there is a need to raise up the next generation of planters, missionaries, and not just those that would do ministry, those in the marketplace. Right, every Christian we want to see equipped, but not everybody can go off to a seminary or do an online program that costs a significant amount, and yet there is significant opportunity. Many times I encounter people, even in ministry, who will say, "We don't need any more church plants. We have enough. We don't need missionaries. We've done damage through mission." There's a lot of stereotypes.
Yeah.
But there are some things you sent me. So, for example, and I think this was from Barna, from research they on Christian cities. The most post-Christian cities in America, and most of them were in the northeastern U.S. We've got, I think this is Providence, Rhode Island, New Bedford, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Connecticut, Rochester, New York. They have cities here. Then we finally get to Tacoma, Washington, but mostly the Northeast is high ranking for what they would call post-Christian cities. And I even see Philadelphia, where I'm at, is 22nd on the list of 100. And there was some criteria you sent. 55 to 60% of individuals meet at least 9 of the 16 criteria. Some of those criteria are they do not believe in God. They identify as atheistic or agnostic. They disagree that the Bible is accurate, or they deny its accuracy. They have not attended a church in the last 6 months, and they have not read the Bible in the last week. It's kind of a summary. And so I think oftentimes within the church we operate in a scarcity mindset. How do we keep our existing churches thriving? But if God were to move tomorrow and there was an outbreak of preaching and people were coming to Christ, number one, there would not be enough churches for everyone to attend. But we also need ministry that is on the ground and growing in the Northeast of America. Most of what we see in terms of heretical thinking and New Age stuff there's nothing new, under the sun. Paul encountered similar things. Timothy had to deal with all of that, but the difference is they had a model, they had discipleship, and so a lot of what you're saying kind of speaks to that. And my concern, and for those who listen who know me, I'm a student at through Antioch with you. And, I went on a search for a while, the Bible school, seminaries, and it's like, I don't want to be in debt, and I also don't have time for daytime courses at 10 a.m. I work, I work a lot. And, one of the things that concerns me now, when you look at median household income, just in my context, for African Americans, $45,000 a year is the median income. For Hispanic households, $55,000. I think for Caucasian households, it's like $72,000. It's getting harder and harder to make it economically. If you throw in Bible school or seminary, it's not going to happen for many people. And so now we need relevant training, education, and things that don't dislodge people from the local church, because we've already got a lot of folks leaving cities, either for better opportunity or just look. They're like, I could go live at home with my mom and dad. I could live in the garage for free. I am leaving Philly. I'm going back to, Chicago or the suburbs, or I'm going to Minnesota, where I'm from. And so now we have this need, and I think one of the things that you can speak to this is Antioch is affordable, but it It is based on you being in your church, thinking about your context. I think some time ago, maybe last year, I wrote a paper, and you sent it back to me. And you said, "Hey, this is good, but it needs to reflect your context." Didn't think I would get
Right.
that. They're like, "Hey, this is well written, but it needs to be in your context." And maybe you could speak to that model of education and how that's different than the typical seminary.
Yeah, so there's kind of three things here. One's your formal seminary. You go off to Bible school, you go off to college, seminary, and you get your education there. And one of the drawbacks, I think, to that, one of the big drawbacks I see, and finance is one of them, but quite honestly, regardless of what the finances would be, I think the model that Antioch School has a lot of other reasons why it is preferable. One of them is that you take an 18-year-old and you stick them in a Bible school setting. His experience in terms of, and let's say he's going there because he wants to learn the Bible and be a pastor. His experience in pastoring is going to probably be pretty minimal. He may have had some, he may have done some work with his church and so on, but generally it's pretty minimal. A guy turns 18, he's like, hey, I feel like I should be a pastor. I'm going to go get a Bible degree pastor. He has no clue yet what he needs to learn. And one of the beauties of doing it right here locally is Chris Miller, who's pastoring at One Life and has been in our Antioch school since 2011. He knows week to week why he needs to learn this stuff. And, it's right there for him. I don't have to convince him that you need to learn this or that or the other thing. It's right in front of him all the time. So I think that's one of the benefits of that, versus where you go off to school, a place where you go off to school. The other thing, and you mentioned context. So now there's some benefit in going off to school in rubbing shoulders with people from other culture and other contexts. And I don't want to diminish that, but a guy from our area and a guy from your area come together, and that's good. But it's going to be difficult often to help them understand their ministry responsibilities within their context, because you're not going to have it, most likely, depending on where you're at. One or the other is kind of going to miss it. So that's just another piece. Again, none of these are like stake in the heart of it. They're just pieces that I've been putting together and saying, I think this is why Antioch School would be preferable. But what I want to get to is there's a difference also between what Antioch staff talk about as church housed and church based. Mm-hmm. And one of the easiest ways for me to address that is to talk about home in the terms of homeschooling. So a lot of people school at home for various reasons. A lot of times it's because they don't like what's going on in the building down the road.
Right.
Whatever that might be. It might be just poor education. It might be the curriculum design, whatever it might be. But what they do is they bring their kid home and they try to replicate the public school system in their house.
Wow.
And it doesn't work because the public school system is designed for efficiency in that building down the road. And that's like the church housed. In other words, we're going to bring the seminary, but we're going to do it here in our building.
Right.
But it still misses some of the important aspects of church-based. And so church-based is more the way I homeschool my kids. I'm not trying to replicate what the school's doing. I'm doing my thing. Now in New York State, it has to meet certain standards that the school has, and that's fine. But my kids don't sit in desks, like a one-room schoolhouse and all of that. I'm not trying to replicate that. I'm trying to help each one of them individually learn in the best environment that they can learn in. Mm-hmm. So I think that's sort of the key with church-based is I can look at the various students and uniquely tailor their educational experience for who they are and what ministry they're in particular right now.
And I want to add, I probably need a whole podcast on homeschooling I'm a big proponent of that, and years ago I was a big critic of it. Right,
Yeah.
the idea being if you're homeschooled, you'll be shut in, you won't have any social skills, you'll be a weirdo, you're basically Amish but living in the city, and my experience has been so different. And I think it is a big consideration we need to discuss. Not everybody can do it, but I think it's definitely something we should move towards. But one thing that's significant there is also with Antioch, it is not necessarily for Reformed people only. It's not this Calvinist school. It is for all denominations. You've had people come in. I think we had one semester where I think you led. We had maybe an Anglican there. We had some house church people. We had all different types of ecclesiastical forms, denominations where people can come in and be equipped. And also, you don't necessarily have to take a class for degree credit, right? You can come in and take a class, and first and foremost that comes to my mind is the Lifeline Course. So life and then the letter N for people that are following, and that's the first course people take usually when interacting with Build.
Yeah.
And my experience, it was amazing because you're not saying let's go deep into the theology first. Really, let's just go into the character and life of the student and help figure out where you're going and how to get there. One of the things I got was just this: number one, you're working through the book. You're figuring out what are the habits that I need in my life towards where I'm going. How do I think in terms of 5 years and 10 years? That is so key to many folks in every context, not just urban areas. And I'm not talking about pastors and church planters, but Christians that take Christ seriously. All right. If we're going to make our time count, we need to give really serious thought into how am I leading my life, my family, how am I developing my gifts and stirring them, right? And I think sometimes the church can hoard gifts in a sense. But I think what Life End does is it helps to kind of unleash it and help people have a plan to develop. What I hear from many folks, especially millennials, which I don't know, some church will say I'm a millennial, others don't. So I'm just going to claim it. Us millennials, when I talk to others, there's this sense of what does God want me to do and how does he want me to do it? I'm going to fast and I'm going to pray. The two things you usually don't get there is I'm getting in the Word and I'm getting with people that'll help me. And people forget, I think it's Proverbs 15:22, plans fail for lack of counsel, right? And sometimes we're setting ourselves up for failure because we're going off emotion and have no plan. How would you speak to Life End? Because I know you've also, I believe, been a student there and kind of refined your own plan based on the principles of Life End. How would you describe those principles?
So I'm gonna start with a mental picture for you, and it kind of relates to something we talked about earlier about preaching out of the Word, and it came in the context of a preaching workshop, but it applies to this as well. So you have a car, and you have yourself, and you have a Bible. Those are the two persons, if you will, in the car. And for a lot of people, the Bible is in the trunk, and they're in the driver's seat. So the Bible just doesn't have any impact on them at all. The only impact it has on them is if they get a flat and they got to get it out, and, some crisis, and they got to figure something out. Then they'll go find their Bible. Right. Then for a lot of people, it's in the back seat driver. The Bible's in the back seat. I'm in the driver's seat. The Bible keeps yelling advice at me, but I don't want to hear it. I'm ignoring it. I'm doing my thing. I'm on my way. Now, a lot of us conservative, very evangelical types, we know those two are out. That's not good. And we think we got it together, but actually, we have the Bible in the front seat, but it's actually still in the passenger seat. Wow. Gives us really good advice. It's the place we look for answers and so forth, but we're still going to control the steering wheel. And I like the picture of, if you're really doing it right, the Bible is in the driver's seat. It's taking you where you need to go. And again, that's what happened with Ken. As he's teaching through Acts, the Scripture begins taking him where we needed to go. And Life End is similar in that way. while it's not overly heavy on the Bible, its principles come out of the Bible, and that is wisdom, the wisdom principle. Understand who you are made to be and how that's supposed to get worked out then. I think that's really the key to life end. And one of the, in terms of the Bible, I tell you, one of the passages I know I talked about it a little bit under our homeschooling, but a passage of scripture that just has been so instructive for me is out of Luke 2:52. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Yeah. So the four areas of life, I think, in terms of individual person, are covered there, right? My mental capacity, my emotional capacity, my spiritual capacity, my physical capacity. It's all there. And life end then takes those and develops them in four areas of life. You as an individual, then you as part of a family, and then you as part of a community, which includes your church family, and then you as part of a world community. And so it gets people beyond themselves. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it helps them identify what's unique about me. What do I need to contribute here? It's less about what do I want to get out of life and what should I be giving into life. And I think that's a key thing with Life End. It's not about, hey, here's what I can get out of this. It's what do I have to give? What did God give me in order to give others? And if you do that, you're getting at what Paul's after with the Corinthians, right? Like, hey, stop thinking about your gifting as what you can get out of it. Your gifting is given to you so that you can minister to others.
Exactly. And that's profound. You know, we're told to love the Lord our God, all our heart, our soul, our mind. We want to put our being into it. And I think many times those of us who are in, you know, people don't want to say evangelical anymore, whatever you want to call it. Those of us who say we love the Bible sometimes say it in a Pledge of Allegiance sense, right? The Bible is my rule book, is my guide, you know, but we don't really think deeply about our lives and how we're making the most of it and how we're giving of ourselves to Christ, right? So for me, I know my struggle is people pleasing and being able to say no. And one thing I got from Life End was, you know, there's times in my week and in my life where I need to develop these rhythms that are helping me get to a point. And I need to guard those, because if I don't have these things here, I can't really get to where I believe God is taking me and my family. And so I have to be able to say yes to some things and no to, and it became so clear to me as I'm thinking through the next 10 years, that helps, you know, people who are like me, you know, where it's like, I want to honor God, but I don't want to say no to this and that function or things at church, you know. And I think for any leader, you know, I say again, this isn't just a course for pastors. This isn't just a course for missionaries or church planters. This is, you know, the Sunday school teacher at church, or the homeschooling mom, you know, or a man who doesn't do much at church, but he's faithful to his wife, caring for his kids, but he's trying to figure out, how do I make it in this? You know, do I go all in on my career, or, you know, do I make time for ministry? I think that the Life End course causes us to think on those things. And, you know, if I were still pastoring, you know, the time that I tried to put into discipling and working with people, I would throw them in that course and then say, you know, let's kind of work through that. You know, what are those implications and how does that look right now? And so I'll say two things before we move on. What was also great is the Life End course, we took it at night. It's not always the same, but it's not like you got to do it 12 noon. I think when we did it was Mondays at 6 p.m. or something like that. And again, super affordable. And I think the book was $20 or $30 or something like that. It was really cheap, but really helpful resource. So I can't commend it enough. By the way, Bill is not a sponsor of this podcast. Nobody at Antioch has sanctioned this. So, you know, just throwing it out there for the sake of God's people. But, you know, again, that's really helpful. And I think overall, the experience at Antioch, I mean, the people I meet through Zoom, even good relationships, and I love hearing the perspective of people in different places than me. I've had classes with people in, you know, New York, I forgot where Pastor Jamie was, Canada, you know, and just hearing their experiences has helped me to grow. And you know, and that's significant. And so, you know, moving from that, I would imagine Antioch is this, did I say right, church-based, you would say.
Yeah.
Um, And so if leaders are getting that, my imagination says that CentrePoint is where you come alongside somebody and say, here, we'll work with you to kind of flesh that out in your own context. So you got the educational resources at Antioch, and here's Pastor Mike coming, riding his motorcycle down to your church, Mad Max style, for CentrePoint, saying, hey, let's work out how do you practically do this, and what's kind of been your experience doing that?
It's a bit challenging because denominationalism is a bit of a challenge, and I don't have a problem with denominations, but denominations generally have their education systems and their places they want people to go. They have institutions of it, so you really end up more fruit generally coming out of independent churches, which have their own problems because they're independent, so they kind of do their own thing as well. So what I'm hoping, what I'm desiring out of CentrePoint is the development of a network where we're interacting with one another around these things. And so the experience has been, I think in part that it's been a bit slow. For one thing, I don't hear of a lot of guys who really want to move into ministry, men or women who really want to move into ministry. And again, I don't even mean necessarily vocationally. I just mean like significant aspect of their ministry is going to be teaching the Word of God, mentoring, pastoring, whatever that, preaching, whatever that might look like. So but what's happening with Chris has been really helpful. When I first met up with Chris, I said to myself, okay, he wants to be a pastor, but I think this is a guy who's actually much more designed to work more regionally. But Chris didn't see that at the beginning. He really is like, I'm not a pastor. So we started on that. We got him into pastoring a church plant. And just within this last probably 6 months, he has said to me, I'm realizing that my gifting is in teaching, not in shepherding. And that I probably need to expand this more broadly. And I said, oh, this is good. And so again, this is part of what I like about the way we function is he owns that himself now. It's not me saying to him, hey, Chris, you need to know this. You need to know that you're this and this and that. He owns it because he's come to that conclusion as he's been ministering. And he's done a good job pastoring. And it's a good experience. He needs to have that experience if he's going to work regionally. But the realization in his mind, like, I need to train up a leadership team for One Life Community Church so that I can broaden what I do beyond One Life, not excluding One Life. That's been really, really good to see. And I think, again, he did the big life end, which is called SEMA MAP, which, it's a little more expensive, but it comes with the bachelor degree that he's going through. That's been showing him these things. And what I like about Life End is you go back and you review this stuff. You look at it over and over again. So there's a thing out there called SMART goals. I don't know if you're familiar with SMART goals, right? Yeah. And I like SMART goals, but I think what's missing is the smarter goal, and that is the evaluation and revision of the goal. So what I like about this, with Life End is I put this stuff out there. I'm going to look at it a year later and I'm going to ask myself, is that happening? If it's not, why isn't it? And what do I need to do to adjust for that? And rather than just keep pouring more time into something that's maybe not even working right. So how do I revise it? Do I change the goal or do I change my approach to the goal? But by doing that every year, you're helping actually mature into something rather than what I find a lot from guys is their plan is this. Here's their plan. I want to read the Bible more. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, how are you going to know when you're reading the Bible more?
Right.
Yeah. I want to be a better teacher. Okay. How are you going to know when you look back a year from now, how are you going to be able to say I'm a better teacher? So, and this happens in the church. Churches don't really know how to assess themselves to know if their ministry is really being fruitful. Most of them assess themselves by, do we have more people coming or more money coming or more people getting saved or something like that. But they don't really have a solid way of saying this church is maturing in Christ, which is different than church is just better. You can have more people coming. That doesn't mean you're maturing in Christ. You can have more money. Doesn't mean you're maturing in Christ. You can even have more converts. Doesn't mean you're maturing in Christ. So one of my pushes for church leaders is you've got to assess regularly what's happening in your church in order to understand if you're actually fruitful or not. And not just keep, and this is one of the things that pandemic has kind of helped with. A lot of churches had to, they had to shut down kind of what their traditional church was like.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what I've been encouraging pastors to do is don't jump right back into what you were doing before. Take time now to assess that. Was Sunday school, the way you did it, really fruitful? If not, maybe think about doing it a different way. Was your outreach really fruitful? If not, think about maybe doing it a different way, because you got now an opportunity to redirect because people are already like, hey, we're done with whatever that was. What might it look like to do it differently?
This is big. We got to park here